Welcome to Technology Tangents. We get leaders together to discuss the important tech of today and the implications for tomorrow. Our discussions are fun, lighthearted, and frankly opinionated, but hopefully gives you a sense of what matters, what to pay attention to, and what to ignore. Joining me today is Jason Goth, our CTO. Hello, Jason.
Hey, Vincent.
How are you doing today?
Great.
You enjoy some fishing over the weekend?
I did.
Catch anything?
Let's move on.
These are very laconic answers. I feel like this might be a rough go at it. So
let's move on.
Continuing, joining me also is Kevin. Hello, Kevin.
Hello. Thank you.
Our chief strategy guy. How about that?
Well,
Can that be a title?
Sure. Make up title. I'm doing well today. I just want to make sure, clarify. Today, we're going to pay attention to Jason, and you can ignore me.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Yeah. So Jason doesn't want to talk and you don't either. So it's going to be a Vincent show here for the entirety. Therefore, into the podcast now.
I just didn't want to talk about this past weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Other things you're okay with. Yes. Well, we're going to test you. I want to talk about AI, much to your chagrin, Jason. Sorry about that.
It's like the topic every week. No, it's fine.
We did a different one once.
Oh, that's true.
Once. So yes. Now back to me.
Yeah, it was what should we do if you don't consider AI?
And, you know, we had an interesting set of client conversations this week. You were involved in some of them. Both of you guys were actually. And I wanted to pick up on this thread, which could sort of be summarized as, where do I get started? What do I do with this AI? It seems good, seems useful, but where do I get started? And I know we've talked about some of that in the past, but I want to be a little bit more nuanced here. What we're really seeing in our client base, at least, and I think this is representative of the broader world, is this moment when there are sort of different personas who have done a different set of actions to this date, and therefore they have the same question, but they're starting from very different places. On one side of the spectrum, you have people who have 1.5 million ideas, frankly, too many ideas. They're not sure what to do. They've probably done some POCs, probably hundreds, tens at least, of POCs. None of those things are in production, though, and they're not really sure what to do now. They have all the governance, they have all the tools, they have all of these POCs working, but now what? On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who have taken this I don't want to be too judgmental in the term here, but they've taken a very conservative stance. And they've said, well, I don't know, there's a lot of noise out there. It's probably a bit of a hype. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. I think even in that camp, we're seeing a sort of realization that they can't wait much longer. They have to actually get started from this point. And so, you know, maybe we start on the left side of that spectrum when people have a lot of POCs and we kind of work our way to the right. I think in the end, actually, the next step is perhaps similar for both sets of groups. And so we can talk about that. But Jason, in particular, I want to toss it over to you. Clients have done a lot of POCs. They have a lot more ideas of what to do. Nothing's yet in production. And it probably feels a bit like the early days of the internet when everybody went and built a website. And then what?
Yeah, now what? Well, I think, you know, the people that have done POCs have a bit of an advantage in that they have seen what impact those solutions could have to various parts of the business. And like anything, you know, what's the most often used consulting tool is a 2x2. Like, what's the effort? What's the value? How do we get the most value with the least effort? I think a lot of those POCs give people the, you know, at least a rough outline of what the benefits would be, right, across many different, you know, aspects of the business. There's internal use cases. How do we get more efficient, reduce cost? There's, you know, more product or external facing use cases of like, can we add, you know, something to improve our service, which would, you know, drive revenue, loyalty, you know, those type things. And so they have an idea of what those technologies could do. Now, what I don't think they probably have as much of is an idea of the cost of doing it in production at scale, right? You know, because POCs, and we see this a lot. We talked with one analyst firm yesterday, and they talked about the number of POCs, like broken down AI projects by size, and these tiny POCs and the larger, more production ones, which is like virtually all of them, right? Our POCs, very few in production. And, you know, doing that is really hard. That's probably an entire podcast into itself of what needs to be done to make an AI solution production ready. But so I do think they probably need to look at, my answer would be, you have some idea of the benefits. You probably need to think through like what would be the real cost of doing this in production at scale, securely, et cetera, and then make that judgment around, all right, well, which ones are going to give us the most bang for our buck.
Kevin, what would you say?
I'm gonna actually have a follow-up question, Jason. I'd be curious in your perspective on where do you think it's going to be more interesting for a newer, a less mature company or business unit that's going to be able to run with AI versus a very mature organization who's just done all these POCs and really trying to not compare and contrast. You have to know where you're at as an organization, but yeah, I'm curious on the inertia of getting over how we do things today. We've got the money, we've invested in the POCs. Well, now what? And versus just really, you kind of like we don't know a world without POCs. It's a 5th grade graduation in the Erickson household today. In a world without digital, right? We've got so it's similar. We're going to have kids that are going to grow up that didn't have AI. So I guess the question, part of me is the answer is go back to, well, how do we help organizations who you really have to decide where they're going to jump and I think we're at a moment of risk where if you don't, it's almost like it doesn't matter what you do, you just got to move forward. And the POCs was easy, and now it's going to be you just got to pick which ones you're going to start replacing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I think a lot of the internal use cases you can probably buy solutions, which is much lower risk and doesn't have the associated, we have to figure out how to do this at scale. So think the Microsoft Copilot type things. Those are much more of a buy and then change management aspect. Like, how do we actually get people to use them as part of their day-to-day and change the way we do things? I think those are low risk and easy. It's more on the ones where we want to embed as a part of a solution. The customer, the Klarna example, for example, replace call center agents, or an airline replace gate agents, or something like that, or offer some new service that incorporates AI to generate output for clients. Those are ones where you have to deal a little bit more with the production, security, scale type questions. And so maybe you take a kind of a path where we do a lot of those kind of easier internal cost saving ones, and at the same time use those cost savings to fund some of those more difficult production ones.
Yeah.
So I know that kind of a restatement of my first answer, but I think from a maturity perspective, I don't know that it really matters how mature your company is, because nobody's mature at doing this.
Yeah.
It's relatively new.
Yeah.
And so I actually think companies that, if there is a difference, the companies that are less mature will have less, bureaucracy to push things through, which could be, a good thing or a bad thing. But I don't think it matters in terms of the prescriptive advice. That's, what you need to go do either way.
Yeah, that's good. And, I think it's interesting. I've been wrestling a lot recently with this idea of like what happens post the efficiencies. I think the service efficiencies, how it's going to play out. We're seeing that with service improvement, access to data, chatbots, right? I think we'll continue to see companies use that, whether they do that internally or they have models that support that. But how does then a company really kind of ties back into this POC? Where do you start to bring it in, and how do so maybe it's going to go back to like where it's going to be the business processes. And now I start using this for how we design new product, or I do this how we think about where we find our customers, or I use this as part of our XYZ process. Vincent, you've talked before about how this is going to impact our supply chain. So we start using that from a vendor management to picking vendors to authorizing the different components of that overall life cycle. And so instead of it just being like, hey, we're going to completely radically change how we create product on the fly or create answers on the fly, it's going to start just changing inefficient processes within existing flows and supply chains will be a logical place where you go out of POC into those elements. And then we're going to have to start, for lack of a better word, daisy chain together different solutions of what that could look like. And, and now the security side of that, how we think about that, what's the environment, those are all have to become, but maybe part of it, not to get to the end of the podcast as we begin, but it's really around the primary thing you can do is you got to continue to move forward. And it may not be so much, we know exactly where we're going, but we're going to continue to push the envelope from what we're doing. And, the POC is, it's kind of like going back, you don't get fired by hiring McKinsey. Well, you don't get fired for doing POCs. That was the last year. We're a year really into POC land. And so now we're starting the next year into now we have to have measurable results that aren't simply, improving the CSI or, kind of that whole 5-year path. Mm-hmm. So
I think it's interesting, again, if you make the analogy of like mobile or the iPhone, right? Like, well, where did that impact different parts of the business? And the answer is really everywhere. There's everything from, web and e-commerce to delivering services on the iPhone to even, in marketing, right? There's the whole idea of let's, we can track and get much more personalized in our messaging and next actions to customers because we're able to see more information about them. It really has impacts everywhere. And AI is the same way, maybe even more so. It's going to, if you could make the argument, well, it's going to impact every group, every business unit, every department. So again, where do you start? I think that's maybe the question, but that's why I think you're going to have to let a lot of small experiments run and see which ones generate the most value. And I don't know that you're going to be able to say in parallel, because I don't know that you'd be able to predict it's going to be best here. And so again, I would start looking to those groups, distributing this down and looking to those groups a lot. We've talked about who's responsible for this. Everybody's responsible for some piece, but they've all got to get started doing something to, determine which ones are going to generate the most value and then, focus there and use those outcomes to continue funding further growth.
Yeah. It is interesting, again, keeping that vein of instead of in a strategic perspective, oftentimes we look for the best answer. And in this case might be the best answer is actually just movement, bias towards action. And then, again, if we go back to say the last year, it was I want to show progress and how we're doing it. Maybe from an executive perspective, 'cause that's the lens that I typically would look at this from, is hey, we're going to pick one or two areas where we're going to have measurable improvement in something. It could be speed to market, it could be reduction in costs, it could be improved data, whatever pick it is. And again, and almost challenge your teams. It doesn't matter, again, what it is, but we're going to be able to show over the next period of time that we've done that. And then you continue to force or really encourage your teams, and really force might be the right word in some areas, to, it's get the things in the field. I know you just said, hey, around those experiments. I actually think that's the interesting element of this right now is it's so inexpensive to do experiments. You could be running some in production, some in not. You could be having groups around that. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting to me. I've also been thinking about how much time, if you're someone who's going to be using AI tools, models, whatnot, how much time are you spending outside of your own little ecosystem thinking about learning about what's coming and what's available so that can inform the way you use the tools. That's different than, many of our clients, they spend most of their time thinking about themselves, hopefully about their customer, but often it's really internally focused. And it may be a case here where it's actually going to be wiser to expand that aperture of how you're learning and how you're using that. So, yeah. Vincent, it's your podcast, and we've been ignoring you.
I know. This worked out beautifully. I love any of the work here. You all do it.
I would be careful. You. No, I would be careful to say when I say experiment, I mean not POC. I mean something in production.
I'm A/B testing. I'm with you. Same thing.
Yeah, I would say, the interesting thing here is obviously we work together a lot, so we all sort of aligned on this point, but. Look, if you look at the history of technological changes, especially these disruptive technologies, the first to market is rarely the winner. The computers we use, not first to market. The browser you use, not first to market. The iPhone you use, not first to market. The first to markets almost always die. They're really great, they're amazing, and they almost always die. And so I think what you would then naturally ask is well, hold on. If OpenAI and Google and these people are the first to market, this is not the winning solution? And I would say, yeah, that's probably true. I don't think that OpenAI GPT-4 is the winning solution in the manifestation, at least, of ChatGPT. I suspect that winning solution, that company may not even exist yet. And so it's very natural to say, well, hold on, does that mean I don't do anything at all? And you might think that, but research actually suggests that's not right. In fact, Rita McGrath, professor at Columbia, has done a lot of research in this area, but how do you manage disruptive transformation, these true innovation cycles? What do you do? How do you become ready? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And what's common about them? The commonality of the winners is they really maximized their optionality as they began this process. And what do I mean by that in this case? It means exactly what you said, Kevin, which is you really need to start building the muscle now. The most important thing you could do as an organization is build muscle of like, what does this mean? How will I start doing things differently? You're going to have to reinvent that entire process. If you subscribe to Theory of Constraints, which I certainly do, great book, by the way, the goal is the things that we do today that are slow and human-centric will suddenly no longer be those blockers in efficiency moving forward. Those pieces will become fast and quick and lots of throughput. Some other part of that system will ultimately break down and become the new constraint, the new bottleneck of your entire process. So you won't realize the value provided by this technology unless you reinvent that entire supply chain, a value chain, if you will. And so I think that as you start just building muscle, part of that will be identifying what pieces of my processes are the new constraints and how do I go solve those things as well. And that turns out to be, in her book, Seeing Around Corners, this sort of core thesis and finding is that really maximizing your optionality is central. And that, in this case, means really building the muscle. So to the companies that have done POCs, hats off. Great. You're actually on the right path. You're doing some good work. I think, though, it's still a challenge because these POCs were done by and large, not exclusively, but by and large as true POCs. Very cheap, very small, very scrappy. Let's just go do something. And the heart and spirit of that is exactly aligned with what I would suggest you do. However, I also take note that this is machine learning at the end of the day. We've been doing machine learning in production systems for a long time. And as I like to say, machine learning not in production is not machine learning at all. It's only machine learning. It's only AI when it's in production. There are so many challenges that you have to solve to go from POC theory to actual production system that just doing the POC is almost worthless. So I actually encourage people to take a moment and take a survey. What have you done? What have you seen value with? That's great. And then ask the question, what is it going to take to get this to production? And I think this raises the point you said, Jason, which is today, you probably don't have a good sense of that. And therein lies the challenge. Right. Getting really quick POCs, decks, slides that you can show your board of directors or your CEO or your whatever, whoever your boss is. Look at how smart and clever I am. We're going to have great efficiencies. In reality, we rarely see that work out. In fact, the stats we always quote are something like 85% of machine learning projects fail to make it to production. For exactly this reason. They were not ever designed with the idea of being in production. Their constraints of the real world basically prohibit those things either economically or technologically from being real enterprise-grade solutions. And so redesign moving forward with those elements in mind. And if you've done that, then I think I'm going to pass it back to you both in a second here. The question then becomes, I have my POCs, they're production ready, I'm good to go. Do I continue to do more POCs or really double down and get the value out of these early learnings and wins that I have to date? I'm curious if you have any analogies or other experiences or thoughts on how you approach that core question.
I want to go back, the idea of maintaining optionality, building muscles, seeing around corners, that great book. I agree 100%. And I think what you were highlighting there is that maybe a lot of these POCs haven't actually built the right muscles, right? Which is around getting things production ready, doing ML ops and those type of things. I 100% agree with that. I think there's other muscles that the POCs haven't stretched either, right? Which is it requires a new way, when you're going to do a lot of experiments and A/B testing and see if this works and this works and this works, that's a different operating model for most technology groups, right? It's not, I'm going to go fund some big initiative and get a $8 million budget to go do this over the next 12 months, right? It's like, hey, we need to go and do this whole series of experiments, and many of them we're going to throw away, and I need them funded. And we operate in that kind of more lean, build, measure, learn approach than the traditional kind of waterfall or, even, big, agile, safe, those kind of things where big products and roadmaps are funded once a year. That is a big shift in how companies operate, but in their product and technology teams. And like, those are some of the muscles you need to build around, funding those projects and structuring teams those way and operating in that kind of data-driven build, measure, learn way, as much as, or even more so than some of the, machine learning, ML ops and LLM ops kind of muscles. And so again, that's why I say figure out what it's going to take to actually do these things as a series of experiments in production. And then let's, go down that. Again, there's a huge change management approach there. And, but I still think that doesn't mean don't get started, right? There's the old saying, I think it was Toyota, right? That when Toyota did the whole NUMMI experiment in Fremont, that one of the things they came out of that was a new model of change. Was, I think it's something like, you cannot act your way into, or you can't think your way into acting different. You have to act your way into thinking different. Is that right? But and I think that's very much true here. You've got to start acting that way in that very lean approach across many parts of the business to learn like how they can take advantage of this. And do that, a lot of experience, like within business unit or department, figure out which ones drive the most value, and across many of them to disrupt, to determine which ones drive the most value, and then funnel the investment there.
Just building on that, I think there's a lot of good thought in there, Jason. I think it's interesting to me if we think about the purpose of POCs initially. Maybe many companies are through this, but a lot of it is still, I think, the change. It's like actually getting folks that potentially are skeptical, later adopters within your organization. Once you start to see the power of how the tool can be used, and maybe it starts in simple things, right? And again, I think most people are probably past this today, like how you see it in terms of research, image creation, all these different elements like that. But you have to start there. Right? You have to get people to understand that, and then you need to think about how that plays out to your business. We don't know how we're gonna use it in a lot of different areas, but we do know that there's a lot of historically underfunded infrastructure components of our companies that are going to require being invested in: data, security, data cleanliness, all these different things that, when it comes back to like, what do CIOs, CMOs want to pay for? None of this stuff. What is it going to require to be able to truly use, the AI tools at scale? Very consistent, clean data, security, all these different elements. So it's possible that a way a company approaches this, while you're still doing POCs, hopefully increasingly more targeted towards how you think the end case is going to be, you're going back and we're investing in some of the areas that are going to be required for us to truly be able to do it. Because I think for us to get past POCs that are either relatively safe environments and actually into production, there's going to be a lot of elements of that. And, again, you guys, all three of us have been selling these solutions for a long, long time, right? We've all been looking for what's the holy, the holy grail of how to be able to sell this stuff. But maybe this is it. Maybe this is really around, whether it be, safe rooms, clean rooms, personification, all these different themes we've been talking about. And that's going to be kind of the both and strategy. And then if you're going back to your board, you're going to your executive team, you're going to have to show how those wins are going to work out. You're going to get some benefits from doing these things around having more consistent elements of or inputs into these processes, even if we don't know exactly where they're going to be used from the AI chain. And then eventually the AI is going to be used and is going to continue to be used to help make these things all better anyways. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. So again, I think it's great. You've done some POCs. Hopefully you've been strategic about that. You have a good business case, and now you can sort of say, is it worth it, at least conceptually, to your point, Jason? But the other thing worth contemplating for a second is each of these POCs, when done at large companies, often it's been let 1,000 flowers bloom. and therefore the underlying infrastructure and approach to solving these problems is typically disparate. Realistically, you likely don't get much benefit from having 3 or 4 or even 2 distinct underlying platforms of how do I manage data, how do I do SSO, how do I have private models that aren't going to let my data be exfilled from my environment. When do you go back and try and clean that up? Is it now? Is it when you get to that production level, taking POCs to production? Is it too late? Now you can't sort of unwind, or I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the more that those things are there, the more experiments you can do, right? Because it takes some of the load and burden off of each individual team. And so I do think that, the platform play is, or the platform approach is the way to do it. And again, Kevin mentioned some of the foundational elements, building those really quickly with AI tools. That may be one of them, right? Where you focus on those foundations. We rail against governance here all the time. Not that governance is bad and everyone needs it, but we think of it as more of how do we enable people to do the right things quickly and easy. People will do things that are quick and easy, right? And so if we enable people to do the things the right way, quick and easy, they'll do it. And that's the importance of the platform that and the governance team. I think long gone are the days of governance being the board of no that you go and see. And I think that governance teams are actually going to be product development teams that are going to build solutions with the appropriate guardrail, or platforms with the appropriate guardrails for others to go do. And that the way that is not just AI, that's across data and other things, security and other things. And so I think those are some of the foundational pieces that you mentioned that you should go build. Now, will everyone do that? No. And this is just like cloud. Some people put together really, good, scalable, thoughtful cloud infrastructure that was, has accelerated and enabled their growth. Some people did, everybody did their own, and they had to come back and backtrack later and move it. To Kevin's point, I don't know that that's the worst thing in the world. It's not as cost efficient. You won't get all the benefits, but you may discover what needs to be automated and provided as that platform. And there may be a little rework involved, but obviously I would prefer the first, but the second is better than the option of not doing it.
Yeah, makes sense. Seems to me then that what you really need to do if you're in this first camp of you've built a lot of POCs, you have a million more ideas, is take a breath, congratulate yourself, give your team a pat on the back. You're building muscles, which is really good. Hiring them into production needs to be your next focus. And to the extent that you need to build a new foundation for that, maybe build it in a way that is extensible and usable for all of those, so that you only have to build that foundation once. You can quickly port those rest of the POCs over. But then focusing on the business case of which of those do you start with would be the sort of key towards that. Sound right?
Yeah. I don't have my change management hat on completely on today, but the images in my mind as you think about just kind of the change curve, or you think about just even kind of the hockey stick of growth, right? There's a lot of steps on the line that has very incremental altitude that's gained before you have the hockey stick. And I think the allure of AI is that you can get to the hockey stick immediately. But I think we forget about how long it takes to get to the point where you're ready. And think about just even the models themselves are evidence of that, right? How many years of model development before you've seen this hyper growth in the last 12 months? Well, it's not surprising that companies will have to go through a very similar curve of what are those different steps required along the way that's going to be measured in small incremental improvements. POC is a part of that journey. Hopefully smarter POCs along that. The enablement pieces, the change pieces, and then then hopefully you start to really see the growth. And what's kind of is interesting though is that there, you get rays of hope. I mean, I think again the bots and those elements of that have really incremental, increased revenue, reduced costs. Those are really, you see those are tangible. They're quick. They're able to do that. So that helps fuel the momentum for why, hopefully executive teams and client teams will continue to be able to make these as you're going through the more larger changes.
Yeah, that's really good. So fundamentally, you have to just start getting into production because, again, it's not AI if it's not in production, my mantra. And if you're in the other camp, which is you've done nothing, the good news is you can start with sort of green field. You can start with the idea that I need to get the stuff in production and build that in the same way. And I think this is where we've had a lot of success. Of course, we do things like, a workshop around like what are the use cases in ideation, and Jake comes in and does an amazing job, or that a whole innovation team does really around like prioritizing those, helping you get value out of like what we've seen work in industry elsewhere. But also the things like the chatbot in a day, where we have laid out all of that foundational sort of governance bits for you, and you can still get the really quick value. So the benefit to this other category is that some of those foundational pieces are now available either as accelerators or even in some cases as code. And so you can kind of skip part of the steps.
Or as third-party products.
Yeah, right. Sorry. As third-party, that's what I meant by code. Sorry, yeah, software you could buy. Third-party products, right. And so sort of the benefit of those organizations is that you can leapfrog a little bit. You have the opportunity, at least, if you move quickly. But ultimately, from my standpoint, and it's a bit anticlimactic, it's the same answer, which is you need to get started now. Mm-hmm. You got to start building these muscles immediately. And I get it. It's scary. It's hard. It's whatever. But just go build the muscles. And do that in a way that's thoughtful towards what do you really want? You want this to actually create value for your organization, whether that be in the cost savings or the revenue growth side. So recognize this will have to be in production and just use that as your base. If you build that base out really well right now, A, it's super safe because it's just a foundation that you can build stuff on. But B, as you get these ideas that are really good, you can start actually realizing those values very, very quickly.
And I can't stress enough the shift to the lean kind of build, measure, learn kind of operating model within your product and technology teams. Like that's something you can do right now, whether you adopt AI or not. And it's a necessary thing. It is the, to me, it's the fundamental, I guess, prerequisite, right? Because that's how these systems have to operate, right? Because, we've used this example on this pod before of we built something for a hotel company that, would generate, hotel property descriptions personalized to you, the end user. And, the question is like, well, is that description better or worse? Like there's no requirement, right? We can write down, make sure that, what would you write down as a requirement in a typical software development approach? Write a better description. I mean, that's personalized to the person. And so, but is it actually better? Does it actually drive the behavior? How do we do that? Well, we measure it and we do lots of, in this case, multi-arm bandit kind of experiments and come up with the winners and iterate on that. Well, if you don't take that, take that as more of a macro approach of how to do these things, if you're not operating like that, if you're operating like, well, we're going to do a 6-month study, 6 months of requirements and 3-month vendor evaluation, and then a 6-month implementation, like by then, who knows, right? What will have happened, and you'll be out of date before you get out of the first month of that, 12-month project. I am interested though. You said something earlier, Kevin, that I hadn't thought about, which is the POCs may be more of a change mechanism just to get people on board, believing it can be done and showing them what can be done. Do you think it's still, Vincent, you said like, oh, just get started. Now you can skip that POC, go straight to production. Do you think that companies still need to do the POCs to get people on board?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'll clarify one thing. When I say skip the POC, I actually mean do it in production. Sure. I mean do the POC, sure. Like think more MVP than traditional, like the output of my work is a PowerPoint deck. Right. Think of your output as the work as something your actual end users, whether it be internal or external, would actually see and give you real feedback on. Because to your point, I'm a big believer, of course, in A/B testing as a statistician. And I think you have to measure these things because we're just not good historically. In fact, we know empirically 2/3 of the time our best ideas are actually wrong. Only 1/3 of our very best ideas actually move the needle for our end users. And so the only way you find out which third it is by testing. Yeah,
100% agree. I'm just back to the, but that requires everybody be on board of putting in the infrastructure and testing. And so do you need the PowerPoint or, laptop driven POC to even get people on board that? I that's a question. I don't know.
Well, I mean, again, I took the POC to be where you're doing real stuff. It's not around the PowerPoints anymore, but it's an environment where you're playing, and there's, I think we always need to be expanding. I mean, I think there's it's funny. I've been wrestling a lot recently just around this idea of how do organizations or individuals grow, and this going back to Dweck's work of a decade now, a couple decades now, really, right? Growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And I think it's really applicable to right now, because if you think differently, I mean, really the rules of how you lead, how you govern, how we individually grow our careers, companies grow, are being challenged right now in ways that haven't happened at the scale that they've been prior. And it's just, I think it's going to be really interesting. So POCs to me, or testing, or having time, or use the different ways it's been described over time, even going simply back to the 10% of your time to do whatever you want, right? I mean, I think getting that back into what you want. We've spent the last 2 or 3 generations trying to make everything efficient. Everything's a process, like, Taylor and Ford won. Well, now we're coming back and saying, well, what if not? What if it's really around, we use these tools that are going to take away the processes. So now it's going to be around, how do you bring creativity? It's building upon the innovation. So I think we're going to have to find, I think as a company, going back to that idea, do you believe you can evolve? Your people can evolve? Do you give them, how do you test that? It could be structured, right? You're going to go do simple things as part of it. It could be, you're going to build off those key learnings, and then it's going to get more complex. It's going to be, how do you use, again, we're seeing primarily, at least how I'm using tools, maybe it's an indictment of me, is mainly around text-based solutions. Well, how does that start to change when we start using images, or how do we start really, I'm excited as we get more of our ability to actually take data imports from different elements, and we really start to create, and, how do we start, so I think that you have to get, maybe part of what a learning development of a company is that really you've got different maturity for each individual or departments, and you start there. But I think it's going to have to be, corporate development always talks about people have a responsibility to learn. I think this is a case where if you don't help your employees learn, use these tools, start to really understand it in all disciplines of a company, those are the companies that are going to fall away. And so I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit around the change curve, but I think it's actually more imperative now than I've thought in any time in the last year when we've working through this. You have to get, and it's not around the book smarts. A lot of times you've got leaders in companies. We're all leaders in our organization. It's easy to say what to do and not do it ourselves. And I think this is the case where you have to get everyone to believe that you can do that. And so,
yeah,
I think that's the people development, is another parallel path that needs to go. And it's, I think we focused a whole pod on like hiring. And I think in that, when we determined like, well, you're going to have to develop these people. And I think that's another, if you don't have those programs in place, you need to get them in place really quickly.
Right. And I think to your point of the past 2 decades, effectively, if you go back to Clay Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, we've been in this sustaining technology. We've been about, the whole company has been oriented around, how do I just squeeze more out of this? How do I get the efficiency out? Gen AI, I would assert, is a truly disruptive technology.
Yeah.
And therefore requires a different mindset. And the challenge for every organization, per his book and what we see constantly playing out in the organizations we're in, it's a really difficult thing to get an incumbent, a large company that's great, frankly, at sustaining technology, to embrace disruptive technology. Yeah. It's a really hard thing.
I agree. And this is, maybe I'm venturing outside of the scope of what we talk about here, but I think it's interesting to me as we're watching what's going on in campuses in the world, and this concept of control, this concept of like, I'm going to tell Ford what they have to make versus allowing flexibility to that. I think it's an interesting element that you've got AI tools that are kind of also popping in this season where they spur creativity, they spur differences and disruption and all that element. And I think it's really fascinating to see these converging forces. And I think that as a company, and again, I believe in creativity and innovation and disruption, I think you're going to have a mechanism to use these tools, and the companies that embrace that, and that becomes, really how you use this and I'm struggling with the word really around diversity. Because diversity how diverse it is really depends on your perspective. But I think from a company, it's really kind of crazy how you can actually use this to get the best of that. And I think you'll find employees and customers that are drawn to that. And so where do you start today? Knowing it's going to change. Where is it? Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to build because it's a lot more fun to control your own destiny than it is to have to go do what someone else is telling you. And then how do we have winners and losers? Well, I still believe there are going to be winners and losers. And so I think that's going to be the challenge of our listeners and different companies is really how much to the degree that you believe that you can chart your own path. And I think these tools are going to they're going to reduce the barriers of entry in many ways. I know we spent the majority of our time today talking about an established company. How do you change within structure? And that is going to be hard. But it happens. It happens within business units. It happens with, really more progressive type companies. I think you'll also see, we haven't talked about it, but my mind races to how are you going to acquire? How is an established company going to start to acquire firms that have a very different culture around use these tools, and how you would adopt those together? That's going to be fascinating over the next few years, how that plays out. And I think that there could be instances where if you got a company that's really built their whole company around the concept of using AI tools, like that may be very difficult for an established company who's based on efficiencies to acquire and actually bring in. And it's, we talk about these old books, and Vincent have been talking about it. He keeps on bringing up Innovator's Dilemma. I keep on bringing about, Intel and the wafers and the chips, and, and going back to, making, what are the bet the farm moments? Like literally we're going to discard 65% of our revenue because we think this is the future. I think there's companies that are going to be facing that. And it's kind of exciting time to be watching it.
Amazing time. So again, if you're early POC, quickly get those to production, reevaluate what's really worth taking in terms of priorities versus what's not. If you haven't done anything at all, please get started. Do that in a thoughtful way though, and use that sort of common foundation. And then ultimately for both sides of that equation, I think you have to solve this problem of how do you culturally start creating pockets of true innovation, true disruptive thinking? How do you let that really grow? Because that will be the sort of primary catalyst of your business transformation, more broadly speaking, and then letting that sort of slowly eke out into the rest of your organization. Any other closing thoughts from either of you?
None from me. The startup idea, we didn't talk, you mentioned startups, that may be another podcast, but just what startups will be able to do, right? By, basing around these tools. You don't need $10 million of startup in, 10 months of startup, capital. You can get something out working in weeks with very little. And that, I think it's going to drive, I had not thought about the acquisition of those, which is, I think, also going to be an interesting thing.
No doubt. Well, thank you for those who listened. Thank you so much for both of you for joining me today. For those who would like to learn more, check out the insights page at Credera.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join again. Bye-bye.
See y'all.